Evening, everyone. Welcome to Explain Apologetics. I'm Christian Golden. We have Samuel Nesan here, coming to us from the United States of America. I am back in beautiful Malaysia, where it is just past morning here, and so it's late at night for Sam, who's had a busy day. How are you doing, Pastor Nesan?
Yeah, it's been an exciting it's been an exciting day so far today, and I'm really excited to be doing this with you. Yeah, I mean we've had a great week with Dr. Malcolm Yarnell and Pastor Mark Tan's debate with Brent Lengel. This has been an exciting week for us here in Explain Apologetics, and of course more exciting stuff coming up next. But of course, with all the excitement comes a lot of work as well. Not to hijack what the Spider-Man quote there or something.
With great power comes great responsibility. So if you want to ascribe to yourself great power, I'd be willing to co-sign that.
Oh, not at all. I was just talking about great work, really, workload.
Well, with great work comes great responsibility. We'll go with that.
Sounds good to me.
So tonight we were talking about does God require blood to forgive sins? Nameless, we're going to be talking about this in a context of a number of Bible verses, but we had a YouTube question from one of our viewers, Aladin, who asked originally about John 3:16. And his question was, did God send God to crucify God to satisfy God? Now that seems like a bit of a convoluted question, but let's work through that. Did God send his only begotten Son to have him crucified to satisfy the Lord? And I think there are a number of Bible verses that we can go through here, but you had a response to this, Wasser, basically one of our viewers. And can you walk us through your response, sort of the...
Yeah, certainly. So what actually happened is that we had this interview with Brother Sam Shamoun, who is a really excellent job, who really did an excellent job, is what I meant to say, on defending the deity of Christ. And we had this comment from a brother by the name of Allah Adin on our channel. And so initially I didn't know where he was quite coming from. He responded, and he began making statements like the one you just cited. But what really troubled me about Brother Ala-Adin is that one of his comments, he actually said he's been studying the Bible for about 20 years. And I was quite sad when I saw that, because some of these questions that were raised were actually really elementary questions that betray a fundamental misunderstanding of the doctrine of the Trinity and of the Christian view of the atonement in particular. So, I mean, I'm excited to be tackling that. But your question in particular, which you kind of raised, and which I responded to in the comment section, is on, did God send God, to die and to appease God? He phrased it in a very interesting way, and I noticed he did a YouTube video as well, and he has quite a bit of a following as well on his channel. I mean, this definitely merits a response from our side. And I guess the question is that if you assume that God is one person and only one, which is kind of like the Unitarian view, then of course you're going to have a problem, right? Because it doesn't make sense that God could send God and then to die to appease God. That doesn't kind of make sense at all. But the problem is the very assumption that God is only one and only one person. That's not the biblical assumption, particularly if you go through the Old Testament. You clearly find references that there seems to be more than one person to God. And I think that comes out quite clearly in the Old Testament, and especially in the New Testament. So let me just briefly touch on that first, because I know you're going to follow up, Christian, and just briefly say that your response, my response to that was simply that this is a fundamental misunderstanding, failing to account for the fact that we believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. And yeah, I mean, once you start acknowledging that the Bible does portray God as tripersonal, I mean, by which I mean, of course, three persons in that one being, then I think the argument or the objection becomes less of an objection and more of a clarification.
Right. And so there were a bunch of points under this, obviously. And so can you expound a little bit more, though, on when you say what it means more of a clarification than objection, really?
What I meant by that is, on surface, could you rephrase the question again? God sent God?
Okay, so it is, did God send God to crucify God to satisfy God? Now, this is obviously a Unitarian as opposed to a Trinitarian view of the Bible. This is essentially that God is one being that, and so this is a question that I get a lot from friends who are atheists. This is a very popular question. It sort of, it betrays somebody who does not have a Trinitarian view of the Bible.
Or at least
Does
understanding.
not view, yeah, misunderstanding, right. I mean, these are people who genuinely think that it's one being, and that one being has to act in terms of human morality, too, in terms of ideas of sacrifice, that sending your only son to be crucified on earth is the same as saying, for instance, that you would send your own son to be crucified under normal situations, even if he didn't have to be. So I think it's a question that gets posed a lot, I think, by atheists, and I think it is the way you answered it was pretty interesting. And I know you started with sort of the biblical provenance of how we got to John 3:16.
Yeah, so I think that his fundamental objection is that, and you see, again, it's the way in which it is phrased, and sometimes, and this is something that maybe I could share to those of you who are viewing this from home, and you want to defend, and you're faced with a question like this. One of the first things you've got to do before you can even answer the question is to kind of take out the assumption, or at least to expose it for being misunderstanding completely what the Christian position is. And then all of a sudden you realize that's what I meant when I said that the objection kind of loses its sting, so to speak. But my response to this was basically to say, well, based on my understanding of Al-Adin, he believes that God speaks. He's not an atheist, and I would respond slightly differently to an atheist than I would to someone like Al-Adin. He believes that God speaks. He clearly seems to believe that the sacrificial element was an important part in the Old Testament. And yet when he phrased the question to me, this is how it came across. It came across like, if God says, I love you, and he takes his son and kills his son to show you that he loves you, that's not much of a love, is it? It's like me saying to my wife, and to use his analogy in a video that he did, it's like me going to my wife and saying, I love you very much. Here, take my pet cat, and just butcher the cat and say, now I'm showing you my love for you. But that completely misses the point, because if you understand so many problems with that analogy, it is not in any way, shape, or form analogous to the sacrifice of God the Son in obedience to God the Father for the salvation of mankind. Rather, if you go to the Old Testament, what you tend to see is that God basically mandates that he requires bloodshed or in order for sins to be forgiven. He demands burnt offering. So what that essentially means, and it doesn't matter whether you're Christian, you're Jewish, you're Muslim, all of us, I should say, believe in, for example, that God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son. Why? Why would God do that? And that was the starting point of my response, because you see, in Judaism especially, the sacrificial system is fundamental to Judaism. In the Jewish in Jewish culture, at least in Second Temple Judaism, at least until then, right from the Mosaic period, you would always have the killing of animal sacrifices on a daily basis. You would have morning sacrifice, you'd have an evening sacrifice. And what was all that for? It was not that the priest would get meat to eat. On the contrary, what was happening is that God is saying that in order for sins to be forgiven, there needs to be some sort of an atonement. in order to propitiate for sins. So that concept is not a New Testament concept. And for someone who believes in the revelation of God to Abraham, to come and mock that tells me that you don't even understand what you believe in to begin with. So unless you want to come and tell me, like, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God at all, I just think that this idea is ridiculous, I'm going to offer a different response. But since the response came that this is not the way in which God shows love, I felt compelled to start off by going to Abraham's incident, where Abraham begins. God tells Abraham, Abraham had led a lifestyle which on the one hand demonstrated some degree of faith, let's not deny that, but on the other hand, I think Christians and most people who are religious and following the Abrahamic roots tend to to give him a little bit more moral recognition than he deserves. Let's look carefully at the life of Abraham for a minute. First, you have a man that God says, leave your family and go to the land I would promise you. Guess what does Abraham do? He goes to the land, but he brings Lot with him. That's, as far as I'm concerned, you may disagree with me, but I would say that's not full compliance, right, to what God has said. You brought Lot with him. And if you later look at Lot's life would have been a lot better off had he not followed Abraham, it seems. Let's leave that aside. That's a debatable point. Let's leave that aside. But you have Abraham doing that. Now, famine comes. Abraham goes to Egypt. And what happens with Abraham is that he goes and says that his wife, he nearly loses his wife, claims his wife is a sister, wife gets taken to Pharaoh. And basically, it could have been over for Abraham right there because of his decision to go down to Egypt. Now, you may say it's famine, justifiable. Let's leave that aside. He lied. I'm not sure any woman watching this would think that her husband calling her his sister is justifiable in any way at all, right? So leave that aside. Abraham is not a model husband, not in the 21st century at least. So you go back, you go back, and now God has blessed him. God intervenes, saves the man. He's going back with riches. And let me just cut to the chase and say, well, he decides to split with Lot. The man of faith, realizes that there's just not enough grass there to feed all their sheep. And so he tells Lot, go wherever you want to go, and I'm going to go somewhere else. Some people think Abraham was very noble in that. I beg to differ, because Abraham didn't give Lot, it seems, based on my understanding, didn't give him a choice whether to stay or to leave, but which direction to go. So the choice is to go left or to go right. It's not to stay or to leave, right? And I noticed Abraham actually tells him, we are brothers, which is another marketing way of saying it, because they were not brothers. Abraham was uncle and he was nephew. So what happens is Lot goes, and then his life goes downhill from there, right? He gets caught in something. Of course, Abraham goes and rescues him, and then he ends up in Sodom and Gomorrah, and his wife basically becomes a Ajinomoto, pillar of salt.
Pillar of salt, yes.
Yes, and so those of you who are not from Malaysia may be wondering what on earth that is. Let's just say pillar of salt. But there goes his wife, Lot's wife, because they followed Abraham. And that's basically the end. As far as Lot is concerned, his life basically ends on quite a miserable note. And now you have Abraham, and he's supposed to be the man of faith. He goes and sleeps with this slave girl, Hagar, and has a son through her. And there's a conflict right after that, right? Because Hagar gets sent away. So, you can say, well, it was Sarah's advice. But again, if anything, he should have learned from Adam. Don't take your theology from your wife, right? Listen to what God has said, right? So
don't let your girlfriend hear that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, that could go very, very dangerously back at home. So I'm not married yet, so I get to say that.
I am, so I have to watch my words very carefully. I'm not going to endorse that.
Yeah, but I'm sure even if anyone would agree, any biblical wife would agree that your theology should be derived from the word of God as opposed from them. So in Abraham's case, he listened to what his wife said, and later it was that same Sarah that actually said, you know what, Ishmael and Hagar have got to go. So again, he listened to her. My point is, this man has lived a life committing mistakes after mistakes after mistakes after mistakes. And God says to him, offer your son as your only son. And I'm fascinated with the language God chose to use there. He says, your only son. Now, if anything we know about Abraham, it's the fact that Isaac is not his only son. In fact, Isaac is not his oldest son. Ishmael was his oldest son. And we know that, the song goes, Father Abraham had many sons. So Abraham, father of many. But why does God say to him, your only son? Seems to be a factual error. Now, I'll get to that point in a minute. So he has to travel 3 days into the regions of Moriah, and that's a key word, Moriah. Why on earth couldn't he have done it where he was? He had to travel in this journey to go to that specific mountain that God told him, the specific region, and goes there. He's about to kill his son. And what I found really before that fascinating is that he leaves the servant down. Abraham puts the whatever they're going to use to burn that, the wood, I suppose, and puts it on him and makes Isaac carry the wood up that hill. And when he's on top of that hill, Abraham basically fastens Isaac to that wood. Now, this is sounding a lot like the New Testament. And what's happening here is he's going to kill the son. Why? Because God demands blood offering. That's the only reason he's doing that. Now, he's going to kill the son, and God stops him, says something really interesting to him. He says, now I know that you fear me. I don't want to read too much into the text, but you kind of wonder, like, all this while God didn't kind of get the impression that he feared him. Only now. But leave that aside. Leave that aside as it be. What happens with Abraham is a fascinating story, because Abraham leaves that mountain and almost prophetically says, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Future tense. It will be provided. What will be provided? Well, from the context, the sacrifice, it would seem, because although Abraham does offer a ram, why else would Abraham say it will be provided? And we leave that story. We go to First Chronicles, I believe. I can't remember the chapter, but Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, on Moriah itself. That's where Solomon builds Jerusalem. And when Jesus, and if you read the Gospels, he needs to go to Jerusalem to die. He can't die outside Jerusalem. Why? You almost see the same thing again. Here is Jesus, God's only son now. About 2,000 years later, he's going to Moriah, the region of Moriah.
Yes.
And now, when he is arrested, he is carrying the wood up the hill. May not be the identical hill, I don't know. Maybe it is. But he's carrying he goes to Moriah, he's going up in Jerusalem, and he's basically carrying it on Golgotha. He's carrying the cross up, the very wood that is going to be used on the top to fasten him, to crucify him on. So you see an astounding parallel there. And basically all my response to Al-Adin was that if you believe in Abraham, you believe that, that basically that God commanded this burnt offering, which is there, it's right there in scripture, you should have no surprise with the language, God's only son, John 3:16, offering, giving his only son as the payment of sin, because Abraham was willing to offer his only son, to kind of appease a God who wanted that sacrifice. And God is saying, you know what, I don't need your son. I'm going to offer my only son. If you fail to, it's there. So it's not something arbitrary, random, just picked out of nowhere. It's very much in line with the biblical testimony and with the prophetic utterances that Abraham seems to have made.
Just to clarify, it was 2 Chronicles 3:1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father at the place that David had appointed, on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. But yeah, it's an interesting question in as much as it almost seems very atheistic in its tenor. This is almost like something you would see out of like a Sam Harris or a Richard Dawkins, not from somebody who believes in an Abrahamic religion. But then you also moved on to Isaiah 53:10, which was sort of a further area of exploration. And Isaiah 53:10 prophesies, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. And so we sort of moved on to Isaiah 53. And perhaps you can give us just maybe a little bit of background on Isaiah 53, sort of, just the basic background and that sort of thing.
Right. And I was, again, this is something that I was really disappointed by, because when I gave this response, which I did earlier, I was expecting some sort of an interaction with the response I had given. You see, I was not just making stuff up as I went. I'm looking at the scriptures. I'm using the exact terminology directly from the text, right? And yeah, I mean, what happens here is really remarkable. I may be wrong, but it seemed that Dean kind of switched the topic into Isaiah 53. And I'm not sure whether I was the first one to raise Isaiah 53, because I respond to lots of comments and I can't quite recall. But Isaiah 53 came up, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the response was, well, the Jews don't agree with you. Something to the effect that the Jews disagree with you on your interpretation of Isaiah 53, that Isaiah 53 is about Jesus. So just a bit of background. The Jews believe that Isaiah 53 is something uttered by some foreign kings concerning Israel. So Israel is the suffering servant, according to Isaiah 53. And I find that shocking that someone who is a non-Jew would be using that argument. It seems almost like, let's find what other interpretation is. And I notice sometimes the word scholar gets brought up, or the scholars would say this. Fine, scholars say anything you want them to say. For every one thing one scholar says, there's probably two that say the exact opposite. So you never know what, I mean, scholars, that's all they do, right? They write paper, and if you're writing a thesis, you want to write something new. You want to contribute something new to the table. So I'm not impressed when someone tells me what the scholars say. I want to go directly to the text. And I think
that's the argument. It's the argument from authority, essentially. It's one of the oldest fallacies in the book, where it's saying scholars say, and just repeating points without actually backing them up.
Absolutely, and I mean, fine. I mean, if you believe that those scholars are credible, then let's look at Isaiah 53, and I wanted to basically present reasons why I think Isaiah 53 cannot possibly be referring to Israel. First, the most obvious reason is that the language of Isaiah 53, just to read it for you, Isaiah chapter 53 says, "Who has been, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Verse 1 says, "Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, as one whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own ways, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." So it says here, he was oppressed, and verse 7, "and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to its slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generations, who considered that he was cut out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people." So verse 9 says, "And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, and although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. So let's stop right there and just say, could this be in any way, shape, or form be referring to Israel that is suffering for, basically the idea of the Jewish response is that this is Israel. Israel is suffering for the sins they would translate it as because the nations are oppressing Israel. And Israel, is the servant of God that is suffering. And when Israel suffers, the nation, the kings are saying, look at what we have done. We have hurt God, the chosen servant of God, Israel. So just because, the term Israel is identified with the servant of God in Isaiah. So the first way you can refute that is to first of all realize it doesn't say they, it says he. And anyone who knows anything basic about pronouns, you don't even need to know Hebrew for this. He is a third person singular pronoun, right? Third person singular pronoun. It doesn't say they. If God meant to communicate Israel, it seems that God did a pretty bad job communicating that, because the term here is he. Secondly, the context.
So you would.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just to interrupt you beforehand, you wouldn't say that this is metaphorical then, that they're not talking about, for instance, using the third person singular as a metaphor, but using it as a metaphor for Israel, but that they were directly talking about the person of Jesus.
Right. So for me, the way, we interpret scripture is that the golden rule of interpretation is that you always take the text as literally as you can, or you avoid the metaphorical interpretation unless necessary. Right. Unless, for example, right, you see in the book of Revelation, it says that, or David saying in the Psalms, I flood my bed with tears. You don't imagine the Titanic scene, right? David's bed is getting floating, with all the tears that is coming out from his eye. So it has to be poetical then. But when it comes to this, why on earth would it have to be metaphorical? No doubt there are some metaphorical elements. When it says he did not open his mouth, it does not mean that he didn't breathe at all. The mouth was sealed. That's not what it means, right? Clearly, that's metaphorical to mean he didn't protest, right? So, but the point that I'm trying to get at, which is the first fact, is that it's referring to a singular person, right? There's no reason to do that if it is, referring to Israel. Second, the context of Isaiah from chapter 1 is that Israel is sinful. Israel was the sinful one. And so for them to all of a sudden, in fact, Isaiah is saying this to Israel because Israel is the guilty party. Israel has sinned against God. And for them to all of a sudden become the righteous servant, it goes against everything that the book of Isaiah says. So the book of Isaiah is concerned about Israel's sin. In fact, if anything, the text says here, I think it was verse 8, by oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. So if this is Israel, then who is my people? Then obviously that the nations, the Gentiles, are the people of God, which again, I think no Jew in their right mind would claim. So it kind of goes against everything that they're doing that. So that's the second reason. Do you want to say anything first, Christian, before I move to the third reason?
No, I think that was an excellent, I was just sort of setting you up for that. I thought that was something that should probably be clarified, because that's the ultimate sort of the response that everyone kind of gives to Isaiah 53. When people say that it's not about Israel, people who say that it is about Israel will always say, oh, it's metaphorical, he's talking metaphorically. Well, he doesn't talk metaphorically in most of Isaiah. It's not there are poetical elements to it, certainly, but it is fairly straightforward about who it is, who they're talking about there. So I think that it's very difficult, but I think it's one of the objections that always gets raised when you talk about Isaiah 53. So I just wanted to touch on that. Yeah, I thought that was probably something that was obviously going to get mentioned in the comment section.
Yeah, and that's obviously not the only reason. Of course, I think the biggest reason Actually, I think there are at least two more stronger reasons than the ones I've already mentioned. I want to get to the stronger reasons at the end. So
Right.
the third reason. So we mentioned first and foremost, it's the use of the third person singular pronoun he, which
Yeah.
it doesn't say they, the people of God. But the second reason is that it clearly is the people of God mentioned in the text are the guilty party. The context of Isaiah is that the people of Israel, the people of God, were the sinful ones, and yet the suffering servant is innocent. It says there was no deceit in his mouth. But
Yeah.
clearly, Isaiah believes that the people of God are corrupt, and that's why the entire book exists in the first place. Third reason, and this I think is a much stronger one, and that is it doesn't make any sense in the context of Israel, in the entire context of Israel in the Old Testament, that the Jewish people can suffer if they had not sinned. The only reason there was suffering for Israel is because they sinned. So
Yeah.
you can't have a circumstance where the foreign nations are saying, what we did to Israel is wrong. Israel was innocent, and I'm talking about in the context of not modern Israel, but Israel in in the period of first temple, the first temple period. What we're talking about here is if Israel was righteous, they could not have been oppressed. God promised them protection if they were faithful to him. The only reason the nations could come against them is because God himself abandoned them and said, you know what, I'm leaving. You see in Ezekiel, the Spirit of the Lord departs. So you can never have a situation in the Old Testament, really, where the nation of Israel goes into judgment just because the foreign oppressors decide to do it. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
That's a New Testament concept, right? That the people
Yeah.
of God, the church, can go into persecution because our leader, Christ himself, was crucified. So I think this is a strong refutation of that view at all. If Israel was the righteous one, then why on earth are they being oppressed? No sense to it at all. In fact, if anything, Isaiah is the one that is kind of making them notice that you're going into judgment because of your sins. So that's the third reason. Fourth and finally, and I think this is the nail in the coffin for anyone who wants to produce and say this is somehow a reference to Israel, is that look at verse 4 and 5. He has borne our griefs, he has carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgression, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. The suffering or the affliction of the suffering servant produces healing benefit as a result of the suffering for the
Yeah.
outsiders. Meaning, if this was basically the foreign king speaking, what is essentially they would be saying is, because Israel was tormented, we are healed. Because Israel is suffering, we are getting the benefits of that. But we don't find that anywhere in the Old Testament that Israel suffered and the nation that brought them into suffering was healed because of Israel's suffering.
Yeah.
If anything, the nations were judged for Israel's suffering. I mean, the Babylonians were destroyed, the Assyrians were destroyed. In fact, Isaiah promises that the Assyrians are going to get destroyed for what they did to Israel. But the difference is the suffering servant brings healing as a result of his suffering. The suffering servant brings peace as a result. So there are benefits that came as a result of the suffering servant, which is something that no foreign nation in the Old Testament benefited from. So I think, Christian, when you put this together, you have got no reason, unless you want to twist the text to force into it a meaning, deny its plain meaning, him is him, deny its plain meaning and say, well, it has to be metaphorical, it has to be this, it has to be that. I think unless you want to go down that route, it seems reasonably plain that it's referring to an individual whose suffering brings about healing to the nation.
So I think that we should go about God has it is your position, obviously, that God did require blood sacrifices for our sins, and obviously the question is, and I think this is sort of an easier one, is the question about Jesus being the final sacrifice. It wasn't necessarily brought up here, but in terms of, I'm curious to know, is Jesus sort of the final sacrifice for our sins?
Oh, yes. I mean, in terms of the book of Hebrews, makes that manifestly clear that
Yeah.
all the sacrifices themselves were like this great pointer to the ultimate sacrifice that would come. And we see that, like, for example, John the Baptist, even before Jesus dies, looks at him in the Gospels and says in John chapter 1, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Now, none of the animal sacrifices could take away the sins of the world. But, and I think that there's, when I did a interfaith dialogue with Sheikh Muhammad Qutub, and that's on YouTube as well. One of the things that I mentioned in the Q&A, when I was asked with a question similar to this, is that if you commit sins against a regular person, a commoner, the repercussion would be a common repercussion. Like if I mentioned this in recently, I mentioned this in one of the another videos as well. If you shove someone, a regular human being, you can expect to get blasted in the face, right? So that's a common repercussion. But if you shove royalty, someone from the royal family or the king, you don't expect just a blast to the face. You could get your life killed, especially in countries like Thailand. You could, because even in Malaysia, to wage war against the Yang di-Pertuan Agong is to mandate the capital punishment, right? Because you're insulting the king, right? So what happens is, the point of the matter is, it does not matter what you do, it matters who you do it against. You do this to a commoner, you get a common repercussion. You do it against a king, you get a repercussion of royal proportion. But now, imagine doing this to the God, the King of Kings, who by his breath created the sun, moon, and stars, and all the universe and all the galaxies. And basically, the same word that brought those things into existence is defied by a dust from the earth. That's what you have. It's man trampling upon the authority of God. And that's no small matter. And so, I think, since the sins are committed against an infinite God, it requires infinite repercussion. And that's why I believe in hell is eternal, right? Because you will never be able to pay for those sins. You're justly suffering for the sins you've committed against God, and no amount of time would be able to do that. The only way you get out of an infinite punishment is if you had an infinite sacrifice. God himself would have to be that sacrifice that takes away your infinite punishment. And that's why I think that it's so important not just to talk about Jesus as God's gift of love, because it seems to me that Ala-ad-Din assumes humans to be morally neutral. Oh, why would I take my pet and just kill my pet to show my love to the wife? But that's not the analogy at all. As I said earlier, the analogy that should be more appropriate would be if your wife was, had to pay a price for something wrong that she did, and you offered yourself in her place. So that is the only way that you could actually make that right.
It is a question, and it certainly was. You seem to have an interesting back and forth with this gentleman. He does have a YouTube channel. I will say that Explain Apologetics did reach out to Ala-ad-Din and said if he wanted to have a private discussion on John 3:16 and Isaiah 53 via Zoom, which is, I think, the only way we are allowed to talk to each other now. I pretty much, I talk to my wife via Zoom now. So, but we certainly made the offer. He has not responded as of yet. We would certainly welcome his participation in anything. He can let us know whether he wants to do anything, but he did have a few questions about the, I don't know if you want to go into the questions he raised about the translations in Isaiah 53.
So what, not to get sidetracked into the translation issue, we could do an entire live stream, and we've done talks on that as well, plenty of times, I should say. one of the most frequent questions we get is on textual criticism, but I felt that some of the questions that were raised were really, really weak. It almost seemed like someone Googled up problems, textual criticism problems with Christianity, and brought out a bunch of verses, and clearly didn't know what to make of it. Because one of the comments I found really shocking was when he, for example, he mentioned that missionaries that translated the Bible, and I'm like, missionaries don't translate the Bible.
I was going to get there.
I'm sorry I beat you to it.
Yeah, no. Well, one of his issues with this was that, let me get the exact quotation on this, because this was, we did have, unfortunately, there are certainly moments in our relationship where, we do have fun with this sort of thing. And let me tell you, this was funnier than it deserved to be. This was in your conversation, in response to your conversation with Dr. Don Wilkins, who is the senior translator of the New American Standard Bible. He's a gentleman who, during the interview talked about how he works out of his home. And you can tell this is a guy who, probably is very busy in working on this translation. And he talked about so many of the things you're into when you substitute a word, when you sort of when to put a word in there, because the English language doesn't do justice to the original manuscripts. But so he said that the version is, they're not called translations because they don't translate the Bible specifically from the original language to other languages. But then he said that, let's see, this was great. Jews said when Christian missionaries translated the Tanakh from Hebrew to other languages, they changed the text by adding and deleting. The Christian missionaries. Now, this is an interesting idea, and as I don't know if you've met a missionary, but they don't have a lot of time for Bible translation. They are not people who are given to, I mean, these busy missionaries, they could solve coronavirus if we put it to them, if they were able to just, let me tell you, they could do anything, because build churches, build cathedrals, Superman, go around the world a few times, make it spin, go back. We could solve World War II, kill Hitler, all that sort of thing. I mean, it's really very curious that this is a very curious argument.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because I'm looking at that going, the moment you say, I mean, of course, I do have to mention this. Alauddin has been one of the more polite guests that we've had on our comment section on Explain Apologetics. So
let's say, I'd like to say that this guy is completely polite, has been nothing but polite in his criticisms, and we certainly wish him all the best and would like to hear from him regarding this. But
yeah, and we have nothing but love for the man, So I mean, we love him very much, and he's extremely polite. He's been polite to us, so what I would simply say is this: no disrespect meant, but the moment you come to me and you say that missionaries translated this, I'm here thinking you can't even distinguish a missionary from a Bible translator. Missionaries can translate the Bible, I guess, particularly if they're doing it in a foreign language. If you are a missionary in Papua New Guinea and you want to get the Bible loosely translated into Papuan, that's fine. But that's not what he's talking about here. You're talking about initial translations and all that. Missionaries don't do those kind of stuff. You need textual scholars for things like that, people who are experts in the Greek, and missionaries, their expertise is on something else entirely, So communicating the gospel, for example. So when you say that missionaries did that, I'm thinking to myself, I know a few websites that make claims like that, but those are not scholarly websites at all, not by any stretch of the imagination.
No, they're not. No.
Yeah, so it seems that someone's been Googling, and at this point, it becomes really hard because we are very interested in having meaningful conversations. We had Pepper Lim on the channel. and we've invited others as well. We've had Brent as well recently on our channel, Explain Apologetics. So, who is an American Buddhist. We want to have these interactions. We are not just hiding in an echo chamber and saying we want to do that. So I'm hoping to do something with some other scholars in the world as well that I'll leave unnamed. But when that happens, of course we'll notify everyone on Explain Apologetics. But my point is, our goal is not to hide in this echo chamber. We want to have meaningful interactions. But it becomes really hard, Christian, when to have a meaningful interaction when the arguments are brought out are really not straightforward at all. It's not it's not a meaningful argument at all. So, for example, one of the things that came up was the Old Testament in Isaiah chapter 7 says that the young woman shall be with child, Alma, in Hebrew, which could mean virgin, it could mean young woman. In the context, it meant young woman. Definitely, no one denies that. But Matthew, though, how deceitful Matthew is. Matthew corrupted it. He added his own words, making it virgin, parthenos in Greek. Now, the problem is that the problem with that argument, of course, is that it fails to take into account that Alma is Hebrew and parthenos is in Greek. It's a different language. And Matthew is citing from the Septuagint, which is the Hebrew, the Greek translation of the Old Testament by the Jewish rabbis, by some 70 Jewish rabbis. Hence you get the word septua, right? So 70. This is not something that Matthew invented at all. He's just citing the translation that was readily available to him, that was used in his day and age. So if anything, you've got to take it up with the Jewish rabbis that translated that document. So, and that of course leads to a very big, interesting discussion on why the Jewish rabbis chose parthenos, the Greek word for virgin. But leave that as it may be. My point is that when you come and accuse the Bible, Matthew, of corrupting the Old Testament, that demonstrates that you don't understand even where they're getting this guy. Where these people are getting, and you're portraying yourself to be an expert. And if I, or if any Christian for that matter, didn't know any better, and they would actually get shocked, and they would be like, this is really true. Why did Matthew do that? But of course, to anyone who knows Greek or who knows the Hebrew, this is elementary stuff. This is like, how can you not know this? Right? So, those are some of the things I found really interesting. Again, I say this in the context of a lot of love and respect for the brother.
So, now here's a question in the few minutes we have left, and if you could expand upon this. We're sort of talking about some of the weaker arguments against blood sacrifice that sort of people who are involved in apologetics might face. What would you say are some of the stronger arguments, and how would you refute them?
I have yet to come across, I mean this in all sincerity, and maybe because I've not looked as much as I should have at some of the other arguments that have been raised. But surprisingly, I think what has happened in the internet age is that many people actually don't read books anymore. And they tend to try and get the answers from Google, which is good, but sometimes many of these websites, to try and attract readers, try to dumb down the language. They're not writing for a theological journal. They're writing for someone who knows next to nothing on the subject. And when you use those kind of information, sometimes even though it may be right, it exposes, and basically you have this idea that, I'm now an expert on textual criticism. That becomes really dangerous, right? Because when you try to point out faults in other people's belief, you end up not doing a very good job, and the objection is not strong at all. This is, for example, one of those reasons why I try not to quote other people's scriptures when I deal with them. When I have interfaith dialogues with Muslims, I try not to quote the Quran. Or if I do, I'll just probably mention one word, and I'll almost immediately look at them and say, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert in the Quran. I'm trying to be an expert in the Bible and trying really hard to do so, but I'm by no stretch of the imagination an expert in the Quran. So I must be humble when I approach it and not try to cite the Quran like I know what I'm doing. So I stick to what I do know, is the point. So in that sense, I've not come across a really, really strong objection. But if you want to talk about by comparison, I mean, what are some of the challenges, the most common challenges you get? It would be this: God doesn't need a blood sacrifice to forgive sins. God doesn't
Right.
need a blood sacrifice to forgive sins. God can, I mean, think about it. If you sinned against me, I could just forgive you like this. I don't need
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't need someone. I don't need you to cut your finger for blood to come out in order to forgive you. So that has
Right.
come across as one of the more rational challenges against this idea. What it
Right.
fails to take into account, though, is two things. First of all, you can respond to this with a very easy analogy, and that analogy goes something like this: every time you forgive someone, you end up paying the price for them. For
Right.
example, if someone hits my car, or let's say, if someone is if someone is like takes, I mean, let's assume that someone accidentally dropped my laptop. I just recently got a new laptop. So what happens if someone takes my laptop and drops it, and unintentionally, didn't mean any evil? What's going to happen? Or let's just go with a car analogy. What if someone just rams into my car, right?
Right.
I have an option here. I can either make that person pay for the damage. I can make a police report and claim it from their insurance. Or, as the person claimed, I could just forgive the person.
Right.
But if I do forgive the person, who has to pay for that car? I do. Either I pay for that car, or I live with an imperfect situation. Now, if God is perfect and we trample the perfection, the holiness of God, God could either make us pay, which is what hell is, or he could pay for it himself. That's what the atonement really is. It's God saying,
Yeah.
I forgive you, but that the sins committed against God require justice to be done. And I think somehow in our day and age, we love it when Lady Justice closes her eye, is one eye shut, That's not
Yeah.
how God is. That may work with corrupt officials. That does not work with an all-seeing God. So if
Yeah.
God is all-knowing, and since God is all-knowing, since God is all just and all good, he will not let any sin go unpunished. Imagine this: your loved one, or someone you cared for, or someone I cared for, was really hit in the face and damaged, really punched up and beat up, and I call the police, and the police arrest him and goes to court, and the judge says, "Oh, we see all the evidence, we know you're guilty, but I'm feeling really generous today, and I'm going to let you go free." How many of us would leave there saying that's a just judge? No, he's a judge that failed miserably to carry out justice. Justice was not done. So
Yeah.
what we need is either to pay for our own sins, or to have God himself pay for it for us. Now, some people would say it doesn't make sense to transfer the sins to someone else. But I'd submit to you that Jesus, first of all, is not someone else. Jesus is God.
Right.
When we say that it was the
Yeah.
will of God,
Yeah.
God has one will. It was Jesus, on the one hand, on the human level, Jesus has an additional human will. But
Yeah.
in the sense, God is united in his will. Right? That's why Jesus can say, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down on my own accord. I have the power to lay it
Right.
down. I have the power to take it back again. This is what the Father has commanded me to do. So it seems to me that to make and say that, oh, it's wrong to throw it on someone else, fails to take into account that Jesus himself is God. And ultimately, I think, Christian, that all these objections or these challenges, which again, I said are not very strong, boil down to some fundamental misunderstanding of what we believe, because once that is taken into consideration, it seems
Yeah.
pretty consistent.
Is this a very modern misunderstanding? It's a series of misunderstandings that I think it's really, you talk about the Google age. And I think it came up, sort of the Google age came up sort of hand in hand with, again, I brought him up before, the sort of Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, kind of very easy answers about Christianity. Sort of these very reflexive kind of criticisms that didn't really address any of the substantive issues of Christianity. Like, for instance, you can look through Richard Dawkins' books all day. You will never find any sort of theologian who has made any sort of decent point. It's always they find, one pastor in the southern United States who has, said something ridiculous. And Richard Dawkins will say, see, this is Christianity, as if it were a decent point. And I think that it's sort of these became a lot of the textual criticisms of Christianity, so much so that now you even see them from people who believe in Abrahamic religions, as our friend Aladdin does. And they're using them against it, but it also, as you said, disproves his own Abrahamic religion if he doesn't necessarily buy into this sort of idea that God does require blood sacrifice, or did require it at some level. Is this sort of a modern phenomenon? Sort of you said about Google, but is it sort of this kind of vulgarization of the discourse when it comes to Christianity that's really become much more simplistic because of a confluence of factors?
Right. I think that it's not a new objection, but it's an objection that has come across in many different times and in many different ways. There are many versions, of course, of that same objection. But I think either way, it boils down to a failure to take into consideration what we actually believe. Now, that's not a cliche. I know some people think that, okay, it's a cliche. Every time someone engages you, say, well, you don't understand. If you understood Christianity, you wouldn't say that. No, I tell you, I can honestly tell you, I've played the devil's advocate in debates, in mock debates. We've done this among ourselves many times. Pastor Mark Tan, myself, Silas Lau, some of the people in Explain Apologetics, we get together and, the other guy, of course, is Samuel Chan. We need to mention him, who kind of loves this.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Samuel Chan, of course, is working on a book currently on the moral argument. So we get together and we want to engage one another. And when I play the devil's advocates, I found this, not to sound to puff myself up, but we have found that our objections against Christianity in our mock arguments are actually much stronger than the atheistic arguments or some of the other arguments out there, because we kind of understand the system. We know the problems within the system, and we know what we don't know. So there are lots of things we don't know. Let me be the one to, openly admit, we don't know a lot of things. Unfortunately, instead of those objections going that way, many of our objections tend to be towards things that are really simplistic. So, I would say that if you want to hear solid objections that are raised, read Catholic apologists, because those are some of the guys that are really into church history. They know church tradition.
Catholic apologists are, I know one of the things I used to, because I was a former Catholic, and I used to not think the Catholic apologists were really worth anything. I know that Brother Michael, who is one of our Brother Michael Lim, he's actually turned me on to a few of the Catholic apologists, and really interesting stuff.
So just a quick point, and that is that when you look at one of the things that these Catholic apologists are really good at, and I'm not a Catholic, obviously, and I disagree with many of the things they say. We have a lot of similarities, no doubt about that, but we disagree as well. But I have a lot of admiration for Catholic apologists, because they're so well versed with historical theology. They know the theological issues in the past. They know the early church fathers. They know their stuff. So they're familiar with the traditions. They're familiar with how we got what we got. And so when you actually have debates with them, it's actually much harder to debate a Catholic apologist than it is to debate, say, someone from the other Abrahamic faiths, because they understand the issues that are going on within the faith, and sometimes you can bring those out. And I think that those kind of challenges are good, because they force us, when it's the heresies that forced us to make proper formulations in the early church period, before the Council of Nicaea. It was the heresies that made us sharpen our formulation, our creeds, right? So
Yeah.
I think I'm hoping that we actually hear some actually meaningful arguments that will get theologians working on how to basically make more sense of what we believe. So because if we don't face the challenge, we're not going to actually formulate even further. So the Catholic theologians, we have to give them credit, are really good in that respect. But we don't see the same thing with the others.
Yes. All right, well, interesting discussion. I know it's getting late there in America, so I think we're going to wrap this up, but it's been an excellent time, an excellent topic. And again, all respect to our brother Ala-ad-Din. We certainly disagree with his points, but he has raised them incredibly respectfully. And we mean this in nothing but a spirit of loving debate. So we'd just like to say that. Obviously, explainedapologetics.com. Visit our YouTube channel. Visit our Facebook site. Mr. Nesan, anything you'd like to say in addition?
Just one last thing, and that's if you haven't quite subscribed to Explain Apologetics, please hit that subscribe button. And yeah, that's about it for me.
Yeah, and definitely hit the subscribe button. And you can also, click the little bell next to it to get notifications too. And so we will be bringing you more content in the days and weeks to come. So have a good night. And to everyone watching, thank you for watching. And we'll see you soon.